You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. Those who like martinis might want to forego the vodka. That's because activists in the United States have called on a boycott of that most Russian of drinks. It's in protest at a new Russian federal law, which would impose fines on those accused of propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors. It's couched in legalese, but effectively it would make it illegal to teach children about homosexuality. This latest move by Russia's lower parliament, or Duma, has led to calls for athletes and spectators to boycott next year's Winter Olympics in the southern Russian city of Sochi. A poll by the independent Levada Center in Russia broadly supported the law. But what does it say about attitudes to gay rights in Russia? Well, to discuss this, with me in the studio, Peter Tatchell, human rights activist, Father Joseph Skinner, Russian Orthodox priest, and in Moscow, Dmitry Babich, the Voice of Russia political commentator, and Nikolai Baev, LGBT activist and organizer of Moscow Pride. In practical terms, what does this law actually prohibit exactly?
If you read the Western press, you might get an impression, I am quoting the New York Times right now, that all talk of homosexuality, or for that matter, any kind of sexuality the Russian authorities deem non-traditional, will be punished by fines. I'm not sure that it's exactly true, because if you read the law, it penalizes propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations by a fine from 4,000 to 5,000 rubles for individual persons. 4,000 to 5,000 rubles, that's about $150 to $200. There are stricter punishment for the same kind of propaganda if it is done by a legal entity or if it is done with the use of mass media. The law was adopted on the June 11th, and I would point your attention to the fact that the new law doesn't criminalize homosexual activity itself. Homosexual activity in Russia was decriminalized in 1993, and so far none of my friends who are gay, none of them I've seen been put in jail or tried in any way. Female homosexuality has never been legally punishable in Russia. It was only male homosexuality that has been punishable formally until 1993, but actually that article in the criminal code stopped to be used, I think, by the end of 80s.
But Nikolai, I mean, in fact, the mention there of homosexuality being decriminalized, and in fact there was a rally to mark that in May. It was decriminalized in 1993, but that rally was broken up. Those people in that rally would have been arrested.
First of all, this very law prohibits any mention about homosexuality as socially equal. So this is, in fact, absolutely fascist law, because the same like with Jews, for example, under Nazis. So this is something not socially equal like German nation. This is something what is not socially equal like straight people, like heterosexuality, like so-called traditional sexual relationships. So as for police and so on, you know, this very law is a very strange thing, because the most difficult thing will be implementation of this law, and it depends on executive power. It means that every judge will decide what is propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships, what he wants. And the same, every policeman will decide what is propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships. It means that they can stop any human rights action, picket, and so on. This is very dangerous, because this very law is against LGBT activists. This is against freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of associations of LGBT people.
And I just quickly want to get your response, Dmitry Babich. The sentiment expressed there by Nikolai Baev is that it will lead to further persecution of LGBT activists in Russia.
Well, I'm not sure I agree, because if it had been a fascist law and if parallels between modern Russia and Nazi Germany had been exactly correct, we wouldn't be sitting in this studio. And I think also comparison with the Jews is a little bit far-fetched, because Jews were exterminated in Nazi Germany. They were not punished by fines. They were not punished for propaganda of their values to minors, German or Jewish. What is very important to my mind is that Nikolai made this distinction that this law may penalize LGBT activists. But very often in the foreign press you read that it will penalize all people involved in homosexual activities. My question is to Nikolai, is it really true?
Yeah. Yes. Okay, I will explain. Look, someone is fired, for example, because of his homosexuality. I know these facts as a member of LGBT community here in Moscow and in Russia, that some gay men are fired, and such a man decide to make protest in front of Russian Duma, and police can stop this protest because this may be propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationship. So any mention of homosexuality could be regarded by police, by courts and so on as propaganda of homosexuality, especially if we talk about discrimination, about some facts of discrimination in employment, in housing, in education and so on. This is very dangerous.
Peter Tatchell, there is concern, I suppose, at the use of language of comparing this to Nazi Germany. I mean, those kinds of comparisons don't particularly help, do they?
Probably not, but we are witnessing in Russia a grave wave of persecution of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people, not just by the Russian state, but by homophobic mobs who are luring gay teens to rendezvous and then humiliating, torturing and sometimes murdering them. And the Russian police seem to be doing little or nothing to bring the perpetrators to justice. So it's about the state giving the signal that LGBT people are unacceptable and that it's okay to persecute them. But I want to come back to the interpretation of the new law. The new law is ostensibly aimed at prohibiting the dissemination of so-called gay propaganda to young persons under 18. Now, because a public manifestation of anything to do with homosexuality could potentially be seen by a young person under 18, that means any public manifestation is illegal. It means, for example, in practice, that gay rights marches, festivals, posters, magazines, books, films, even welfare and counselling advice will face criminal prosecution, as will gay couples who identify themselves in public. If a gay person identifies themselves in public, or a gay couple does, that will be or could be interpreted as gay propaganda, and those people could be liable to arrest. Now, if you think I'm being extreme, you've got to remember that for the last 7 or 8 years, every attempt to hold peaceful, lawful gay rights protests in Russia has been brutally suppressed by the police with the connivance of extreme ultranationalists and neo-Nazis. I myself went to Russia in 2007 to support the LGBT community and was beaten almost unconscious by neo-Nazis in front of the Moscow police. Those assailants were allowed to walk free while I was arrested. That's the situation that LGBT Russians face every single day. They are at risk of arrest, beatings, and even in some cases, some of them have been murdered.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Dmitry Babich, the picture that Peter Tatchell paints is very bleak. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, I never participated in these rallies. I covered them as a journalist. And I can tell you that, I didn't see what happened to Peter Tatchell when he was beaten by this mob.
I have seen. I have been there.
Nikolai probably knows better. But I would like to point your attention to the fact that these things, unfortunately, happened even before this law was adopted. And this law, in a lot of ways, it resembles Article 28, which had existed in the UK. That Section 28 did not make the UK a fascist country. Of course, Russia still has a long way to go before we manage to suppress all of these mobs that Peter and Nikolai mentioned. And I think that these mobs need to be suppressed and streamlined. We know that there is no single country in the world that has been able to say that it has a zero level of risk for minority groups from this kind of mobs. There is a criminal code that punishes killings, that punishes discrimination. If Peter Tatchell now says that everything will be prohibited, even HIV prevention measures will be prohibited. Well, just yesterday I went to a bookstore and I bought a book by Margarita Sharapova, an openly gay writer. Moscow Station Lesbos is the name of the book, and no one tried to arrest me. This book was on sale openly, so we still have to see how this law is going to be interpreted, but I have a very strong hope that it won't be interpreted in the extreme ways that Peter Tatchell describes. So my impression is that in Russia, foreign correspondents always expect the worst.
Okay, Dmitry,
And,
can I just ask you? Can I just ask you though?
happens.
You mentioned you raised the issue of religion there, and independent opinion polls in Russia say that something like 3/4 of the population support suppressing public displays of homosexuality. I do wonder, how much of a factor does the Russian Orthodox Church have in this?
I think that mobs which attack people have little to do with real religion or with church.
That's not right.
I have never seen, I have a lot of friends both in the gay community and among Orthodox priests. None of the priests that I know has participated in violent attacks. There are lots of nasty people who align themselves with all sorts of nice religious movements. I think we should make a distinction between the church, and especially between a religion and between extremists.
Father Joseph Skinner, from your perspective outside, I mean, you don't live in Russia, but I'm wondering what your impression of the role that the Russian Orthodox Church can play in this debate.
Mm-hmm. Let me begin by saying that I don't see myself here as being here to defend or even to judge the political situation in Russia and the actions of the government. I'd also like to say that the kind of attacks on gay people, which Peter mentioned, are utterly despicable and have nothing to do with any genuine form of Christianity. It is true to say that the Russian Orthodox Church is close to the people in Russia and has a concern for their physical and spiritual well-being, and therefore in its relations with society and the state will support those measures which may be taken to preserve the spiritual welfare of the people.
Nikolai Baev, how much of this is cultural? How conservative is Russia? I mean, the Levada Center, which is an internationally respected organization, saying that the majority of people are in favor of this law. That's not to suggest that Russians are certainly are in any way in favor of violence against the LGBT community. But there is a conservative strain of thought in Russia, isn't there?
First of all, I saw with my own eyes a lot of Orthodox priests who participated in violence against LGBT people. And as for Russian society, it is as homophobic as any other East European country here in Europe, like Poland, like Latvia, like Romania, like Bulgaria. But if you look at Romania, at Latvia, at Bulgaria, they have gay pride parades. They respect rights of LGBT people. They don't like LGBT people, but they respect their rights. This is very important distinction between Russia and other countries. Of course, most of Russian people are homophobes, but government must educate our people, must support rights of minorities. This is the most important thing. So I think if politics of Russian government changes, everything will change. And this is just the start of our movement. We hope that in the future we will have much more tolerant society here in Russia.
Peter Tatchell, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think we need to recognize that this combination of political repression, intensified political repression, plus religious homophobia, which is being orchestrated by the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, and the mob violence by neo-Nazis and extreme nationalists, is creating a situation where lesbian and gay people in Russia feel unsafe and under threat. Maybe Dmitry's friends, who are perhaps well-off, well-educated, live in nice areas, are not affected. But we've heard so many stories of individual gay people who've been arrested and beaten up. And of course, this culture of repression is making many, many young gay people who are perhaps just struggling to come to the terms of their sexuality feel suicidal. Now, under this new law, it would be illegal for any gay or non-gay organisation to provide supportive counselling to a young gay person under 18. It would be illegal for them to say it's okay to be gay. It would be illegal to give those young people information about HIV prevention. That would be construed as giving gay propaganda to young people under 18. That is the big fear. And it's not just gay organizations that are saying this. Mainstream Russian human rights defenders are also very concerned about this law because it is an attack upon freedom of expression. It isn't just a gay issue, it's a human rights issue for all Russian people.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're discussing gay rights in Russia with Dmitry Babich, Peter Tatchell, Nikolai Baev and Father Joseph Skinner. Dmitry Babich, I'd just like to ask you the question. There is the claim, I think, from Vladimir Putin that there is cultural exemption. Those are the words from Article 46 of the European Convention on Human Rights for lesbian and gay human rights, which he does not see as part of Russian culture. Could you just explain why that's not part of Russian culture?
The notion of cultural exemption is very widespread in Europe. France talks about cultural exemption. This exception française. And I think that every country has the right to go its own way of moving towards progress. I think that certainly letting the gay people lead their lifestyle that they want is certainly a sign of progress, but different countries move with different paces, along this road. So it's not quite understandable to me why the United States and some countries of the European Union are now cracking down on Russia because of these new laws. And they're not cracking down on Qatar, which is also going to have a World Cup on its territory in a few years. And in Qatar, homosexuality is criminalized. We don't hear any cries of wrath from Washington or from London. I think this very idea that Putin is cracking down on NGOs and that he's rolling back Russia into the Soviet Union. I mean, you hear it so often that sometimes it gives an impression of a campaign. This is something that these people want. This is the way certain people in the West want to see the situation in Russia. I see it differently. I think that these laws, which may not be perfect, but these are attempts by Russia to adapt to a new situation when Russia is becoming a more open country, indeed a part of Europe. Under the Soviet Union, there was no need to criminalize gay propaganda because it was unthinkable for a person to be openly homosexual or to talk about that to children in public. Now that this is possible and this happens, now that sometimes, at least until recently, we had gay magazines on sale on newsstands. Now you need to bring all of this into some sort of a legal framework. Okay, this legal framework is not as liberal as it is in Great Britain or in France or in Germany, but it's just a start for Russia. So I would not view these laws only in the negative light. I think that they show that there is a certain movement and there is an attempt to put this movement in a legal framework.
Can I bring in Father Joseph? I'm wondering what role the Russian Orthodox Church overseas can play in calling for a greater understanding of the LGBT community in Russia. Can it play a role?
It's true that the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia has a great lot of experience of living in a more multicultural society, and therefore that, in principle, that experience can be shared with the Church in Russia. Our clergy participate in the meetings of the Church in Moscow all the time. I would like to, if I may, just comment briefly on what Peter was saying, that the laws would make provision of information and counselling and so on to young people about homosexuality illegal. As far as I've been able to gather from reading the text and the commentaries, that's not the case. But, of course, everything will depend on interpretation, as it always does.
So the Russian Orthodox Church can play a role. I mean, is there much division in thinking the Church here in England's views of what's going on in Russia?
Our thinking is from the perspective of faith, and our understanding of traditional Christian morality, of course, is absolutely the same. It's in the Orthodox Church as a whole, not only in the Russian Orthodox Church. I think, if I may also, question this term homophobia, which is used quite widely. We have a case here in Britain where a teacher's been already under investigation for disagreeing with the proposition that not to say that same-sex marriage is equivalent in all respects to traditional marriage is ipso facto homophobic. I think that's not the case. We know what homophobia is. It's what happened to Peter and other lesbian gay people in Russia. To have a positive view of traditional marriage and traditional Christian morality in this respect is not homophobia, in my opinion.
The wording of this federal law, that has the smack of the Russian Orthodox teaching all over it, doesn't it?
Of course. The Orthodox Church believes that the proper context for children is marriage between a man and a woman.
But also it's true that in the Christian teaching, discrimination is not a Christian value.
Of course.
So therefore this law which singles out gay people for discrimination is contrary to Christian teaching and should be opposed by the Russian Orthodox Church.
Discrimination in civil rights on the grounds of sexuality is one thing, but it should not be a crime to have a belief in the traditional Christian understanding of marriage and the family, which is the situation which we are moving towards here.
Okay, Nikolai Baev, can I get your response to that? I really want to clarify the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in this. Do you see the fingerprints of the Russian Orthodox Church over this?
Of course. Russian Orthodox Church played a very significant role in adoption of this law. By the way, I think that we are experiencing here something like second wave of criminalization of homosexuality in Russia. And my friend here in studio said that this is decriminalization. No, this is exactly criminalization, but with a softer form. So they don't put us into jail like in Soviet time, but they punish us with fines for being openly gays. This is the point. And Orthodox Church, of course, a lot of representatives of Orthodox Church, they declared many times, we support such a law, we want this law to be implemented. I think this is a part of this politics of social conservatism in Russia, which we are experiencing here.
Nikolai, can I just point out, though, social conservatism is different to a clamping down on human rights. I mean, if you refer to a country that's socially and culturally conservative, that's not the same as a country that doesn't uphold human rights.
No. Look, social conservatism means that LGBT people are declared as not equal people in the country, yes? Such laws which prohibit freedom of expression of LGBT people, this is also part of social conservatism, like in United States, for example, or like under Margaret Thatcher in UK. This is the same social conservatism. But we have here our Russian social conservatism, which is very closely connected with Russian Orthodox Church, which is supported by President Putin, and this is our social conservatism.
In France, there was a huge march in Paris against gay marriage, and that's France, at the heart of Western Europe. How does this fit into a movement across Europe?
Of course, we are going the same way, like other countries, like in United States in late 60s, like in United Kingdom, like in France, in Germany, and so on. We are just beginning our LGBT movement, and we are going the same way. We have our obstacles here in Russia because of politics of President Putin, of social conservative politics. But we are going the same way, and we will come to the same level of human rights and LGBT rights like in other countries in Europe. But we will need more time. And it will depend on political situation in Russia, because I told you about governments in Latvia, in other Eastern European countries. We are not part of European Union, and therefore we have our unique situation. But I believe that we will have the same LGBT rights and human rights like in other countries of Europe.
Okay, Peter Tatchell, what can Britain do? I mean, we heard the comments the other week from David Cameron saying he would like to export the British model of gay marriage. Is there something that David Cameron can do in terms of lobbying Russia? Russia has a position in the Council of Europe. It adheres to the rulings of the European Court on Human Rights. What roles do these international institutions have?
Well, the first thing to say is that social change in Russia has to come from within Russia. It's the people of Russia who must determine their own future. And I love Russia. I love the Russian people. It is a great country with a great history and civilization. It's made a huge contribution to world history. But I'm sad to say that in this particular instance, the persecution of gay people is a step backwards towards the era of Stalin, when gay people were persecuted. Obviously, the persecution is not so severe, but it's going back in that direction. And this stands in clear contradiction to Russia's own laws and constitution, which guarantee freedom of expression, which protect people against discrimination. This is what the Russian constitution and law says, but it is being openly defied by the Russian government and even by the Russian courts. That is the sad thing. Russia has signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, but it's not fulfilling its obligations according to the protection of the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community. All we're asking of Russia is implement your own constitution, follow your obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights, live and let live. Recognize there are lesbian and gay Russians. They have a right to live in peace and security without persecution.
Okay, can I give the final word to Dmitry Babich? What's your view on that?
And I think it's just extremely hypocritical and disgusting what I have just heard. Comparing the situation now to Stalin's times is an insult to the victims of Stalin's repression, because this is absolutely different situations, and it's disrespectful for the victims of Stalin's repression.
Gay people also were victims of
I would
Stalin's
like
repression.
to say that certainly if Putin said something like he would like to export certain values that exist in Russia to other countries, he would be laughed at, and that would be absolutely justified. So when Mr. Cameron is saying about his intention to export certain values from Great Britain, he should mind the business of his own country. I think that certainly there were a lot more reasons to boycott the Olympics in Britain, when Britain was involved in the destruction of tens of thousands of Iraqis, in Iraq, then there are reasons now to boycott the Olympic Games in Russia. And certainly I would say that the Russian Orthodox principle is to hate the sin but to love the sinner. I think if we in Russia uphold this principle, we shall have freedom of gay activities, and at the same time we shall not fall into a civilizational trap.
Sadly, we've run out of time. I'd just like to finish by thanking my guest. That was Dmitry Babich, Voice of Russia political commentator. Joining him in the Moscow studio was Nikolai Baev. He's an LGBT activist. And joining me in the studio here in London, Father Joseph Skinner from the Cathedral of the Dormition of the Mother of God and All Saints. That's a Russian Orthodox church here in London. And Peter Tatchell, human rights activist and director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. Thank you all very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on the Voice of Russia in London.